The small, faint brass key slid into the lock of the bottom desk drawer with a faint metallic click that echoed too loudly in the empty house. My hands were perfectly steady, though the air in the room felt impossibly thin. The desk belonged to Julian. Situated in the corner of the spare bedroom he had recently taken to calling his mother's room. Outside, the relentless Seattle drizzle beat against the window pane, blurring the streetlights into smears of yellow. I pulled the heavy wooden drawer open. The scent of cedar and old paper drifted up. Sitting perfectly aligned in the center of the drawer was a stack of legal documents and a dark blue checkbook. I reached for the top paper. A monthly statement from Pacific Cascade Credit Union. The account did not bear my name. It did not bear Julian's name. The bold black letters across the top read Summit Property Ventures, LLC. I traced the edge of the paper with my index finger, staring at the current balance of $28,400. Every single deposit listed on the page matched the exact amounts that had been quietly bleeding out of my marriage over the last 7 months. The floor beneath my feet felt entirely solid, yet my entire reality was falling out from under me. I was standing in my own home, holding undeniable proof that the man I slept next to was systematically stealing from me. To understand the weight of that bank statement, you have to understand the foundation of the floor. I was standing on, my name is Clara Vance. I work as a senior financial auditor for a logistics firm downtown. My days are spent hunting down discrepancies, tracking missing assets, and ensuring ledgers balance to the penny. My parents, Thomas and Martha Vance, spent their entire lives ensuring my ledger started in the black. My father was a commercial HVAC technician. He spent 35 years climbing into freezing industrial walk-in coolers and scaling icy rooftops in the dead of winter, coming home smelling of refrigerant, metallic dust, and exhaust. My mother worked the early morning shift sorting parcels at the post office until the skin on her knuckles cracked and bled every December. They lived with relentless, unglamorous discipline. They clipped coupons, drove the same sedan for 2 decades, and poured every spare dollar into a high-yield savings account they guarded like a vault. 3 weeks before I married Julian, my parents asked me to meet them at a diner near their house. My father pushed a thick, cream-colored envelope across the laminated table. Inside was a property deed to a 4-bedroom craftsman house in the Ballard neighborhood. The mortgage was non-existent. They had purchased it entirely in cash. I stared at the paperwork, the ink swimming before my eyes, and noticed the name on the title, Clara Michelle Vance. My maiden name. My father looked me dead in the eye. His rough, calloused hands wrapped around a ceramic coffee mug. He told me the house was mine. He explicitly stated it was not Julian's, not the bank's, and not a joint asset. It was my sanctuary, paid for by their sweat, designed to ensure I would never find myself without a roof. My mother handed me a notarized gift letter confirming the property was my sole and separate asset. I thought they were just being overly protective, clinging to the old world anxiety of blue-collar workers who trusted bricks more than banks. I hugged them, cried into my mother's shoulder, and locked the documents in a fireproof safe in my closet. I had no idea my father was armoring me for a war. I didn't yet know I was fighting. Julian Rossi was a regional logistics manager when we met. He was effortlessly magnetic. He could walk into a hostile board meeting and have everyone laughing within 10 minutes. He remembered the exact way I liked my tea, knew my mother's birthday without a calendar, and possessed a smooth, practiced empathy that made me feel entirely seen. But magnetism is often just a tool to pull things toward you. By our second year of marriage, the charm began to reveal its underlying mechanics. Every decision we made was quietly routed through his mother, Sylvia. Sylvia Rossi was a woman entirely defined by what she had lost during the 2008 financial crisis. Her husband abandoned the family, leaving her with a massive mortgage on a luxury condo she could not afford. The bank foreclosed. She and a teenage Julian, along with his younger sister, Mia, were evicted. Sylvia never let anyone forget the tragedy of those lost square feet. She treated her past misfortune as a lifetime blank check for future entitlement. She currently lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Bellevue, but she carried herself like a displaced queen. Her presence in my home began as a slow, creeping tide. She would visit on Sunday afternoons and casually critique the architecture. She mentioned that the oak cabinets in the kitchen felt a bit dated. She suggested the dining room needed more natural light. Then the suggestions transformed into actions. I came home from a grueling 3-day audit in Portland to find my vintage Persian rug rolled up in the garage. In its place was a sterile, modern, geometric rug that smelled of harsh chemical dye. Julian was sitting on the couch, watching television. When I demanded to know where my rug was, he simply waved a hand. He said his mother thought the old one looked dusty. So she bought us a new one. I told him to put my rug back immediately. Julian sighed heavily, rolling his eyes as if I were a petulant child. He told me his mother was only trying to make our house feel more like a home. The emphasis he placed on the word our sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my chest. A few weeks later, the tide reached my private sanctuary. I had converted the small bedroom at the back of the house into my home office. It was where I kept confidential client ledgers, tax documents, and my personal files. I returned from a grocery run one rainy Saturday to find Julian's younger sister, Mia, sprawled in my expensive ergonomic desk chair. She was 26, chronically unemployed, and possessed the same weaponized helplessness as her mother. She had her muddy boots resting on the edge of my mahogany desk, eating a bowl of chili, dropping red stains onto a stack of blank printer paper. I stood in the doorway, my grip tightening on the grocery bags until the plastic dug into my palms. I asked her what she was doing. She didn't even look up from her phone, simply muttering that Julian said she could use the quiet space to scroll through social media. I dropped the bags in the hallway, marched into the living room, and confronted Julian. He was reading a magazine, completely unbothered. I asked him if he gave his sister permission to treat my private office like a cafeteria. Julian didn't flinch. He told me to stop acting like a tyrant. He said we were family, and family didn't put up walls. I stared at his calm, arrogant expression. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I walked to the hardware store, purchased an industrial-grade keyed deadbolt, and installed it on my office door myself. I locked it, slipped the only 2 keys onto my personal key ring, and went to bed. Julian refused to speak to me for 4 days. He punished me with silence, hoping I would break, hoping I would apologize for defending my own perimeter. His silence eventually shifted into a new strategy. If he couldn't control the physical doors, he would control the digital ones. Julian came home one evening holding a sleek black box containing a high-end smart lock for the front door. He pitched it as a security upgrade, insisting it would be safer than physical keys. The logic seemed sound, and I was exhausted from the lingering tension, so I agreed on the strict condition that I was the primary administrator and no one else was granted access. He installed it the next morning, kissing my cheek and promising it was just for us. 16 days later, I was sitting in my office at work, reviewing a client's quarterly report, when a notification flashed across my phone screen. It was an alert from the Smart Lock application. It read, "Front door unlocked by Sylvia Rossi." My breath hitched. I opened the application's administrative panel. Julian had used his secondary access to bypass my permissions. He had created permanent, unlimited entry profiles for both Sylvia and Mia. They could enter my home at any hour, on any day, without a physical key, without my knowledge. A cold, absolute fury settled into my bones. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, calculated infiltration. I deleted their profiles from the system immediately. I revoked Julian's administrative privileges, locking the software down to my device alone. When Julian realized what I had done, the mask finally slipped entirely. He stood in the kitchen that night, his face twisted in genuine rage, accusing me of hoarding the house, of flaunting my parents' wealth, of humiliating his mother. I told him he had lied to my face and compromised the security of my home. He sneered, stating that a wife who treats her husband like a tenant doesn't deserve a husband at all. The next morning, the automatic transfers from his paycheck into our joint household checking account ceased. He didn't announce it. He just stopped paying his half of the property taxes. The utilities, the groceries, and the insurance. When I eventually confronted him about the missing funds, he claimed he was helping Sylvia with some medical bills and that I made enough money to cover the house I loved so much. His lie was sloppy, arrogant, and entirely dismissive of my profession. You do not lie about money to an auditor. I waited until he left for a regional sales trip. I brewed a pot of dark coffee, opened my laptop, and began pulling the transaction history of our joint checking account. I didn't just look at the current month, I pulled the data for the entire year. It took me less than 2 hours to find the anomaly, starting 8 months prior. Large, Irregular payments had been drafted from our account to a vendor named Summit Property Ventures LLC. The amounts were staggering: $4,000 in November, $6,000 in January, $3,000 in March. The transaction descriptions were vaguely coded as structural repairs, flooring upgrades, and masonry work. My house had received no new floors. The masonry was untouched. I navigated to the Washington State Secretary of State website and searched the business registry. Summit Property Ventures LLC was registered to a designated agent named Julian Rossi. The listed business address was Sylvia's cramped apartment in Bellevue. That was the night I found myself standing in the spare room, turning the brass key in his desk drawer, holding the Pacific Cascade Credit Union statement. The money he had drained from our joint account, nearly $28,000 in total, had been seamlessly transferred from the fake LLC directly into a high-yield savings account owned solely by Sylvia. He wasn't just skipping the utility bills. He was aggressively embezzling marital funds to build a nest egg for his mother, manufacturing fake invoices to hide the theft in plain sight. I didn't cry. The betrayal was too vast, too absolute for tears. I photographed every single page of the bank statements, the LLC registration forms, and the fake invoices. I placed the documents back into the drawer exactly as I had found them. Locking it and wiping my fingerprints from the brass handle, the following Monday, I sat in the polished, glass-walled office of Evelyn Vance, Nos Relations, a ruthless family law attorney highly recommended by my firm's corporate counsel. I laid the property deed, my parents' notarized gift letter, and the photographs of the LLC documents on her mahogany desk. Evelyn brought in Marcus, a forensic accountant who looked at my organized spreadsheets with deep professional appreciation. They confirmed what I already knew. The house was untouchable. The embezzlement, however, was a severe dissipation of marital assets. Marcus promised to trace every stolen dollar, creating an ironclad financial report that a judge would accept without question. Evelyn drafted the divorce petition. She gave me one strict instruction: maintain the status quo. Do not alert Julian. Give Marcus the time to legally certify the document trail. For 18 agonizing days, I lived with a ghost. I cooked dinner. I asked Julian about his day. I smiled when he complained about his regional manager. I washed the clothes of a man I was preparing to financially and legally destroy. The physical toll of the deception was heavy. I lost my appetite. I couldn't sleep. Every time Sylvia came over and casually touched my countertops, my heart hammered against my ribs. But I forced my face into a mask of placid indifference. Julian mistook my silence for submission. He thought he had won the war of attrition. On a Thursday evening, Julian sat down at the kitchen table, radiating a smug, victorious energy. He looked at me, folded his hands, and announced that Sylvia's lease in Bellevue was expiring next month. He stated, not asked, but stated, that she would be moving into the spare room permanently. He told me it was the only logical financial decision and that he had already helped her begin packing her boxes. The sheer audacity of his entitlement hung in the air between us. I looked at his confident, smiling face. I thought about the forged invoices, I thought about my father freezing on industrial rooftops to pay for the floor Julian was standing on. I smiled back. I told him that such a massive transition required a proper family discussion. I suggested we host a dinner party that Saturday, both sets of parents, Mia, everyone. We would formalize the arrangement together. Julian beamed, utterly thrilled by my apparent capitulation. He kissed my forehead, calling me a reasonable woman. Saturday arrived with a heavy, bruised sky. I spent the afternoon roasting a prime rib perfectly, setting the dining room table with my heavy silver cutlery and the crystal water glasses my mother had given me. Sylvia arrived first, flanked by Mia. Sylvia was carrying a box of her vintage wine glasses, loudly declaring that she wanted to start integrating her belongings into her new kitchen. Julian poured the wine, playing the gracious host in a house he did not own. My parents arrived shortly after. Thomas wore his best suit, though his hands still bore the faint scars of sheet metal cuts. Martha looked nervous, her eyes darting between my calm demeanor and Julian's excessive cheerfulness. We took our seats, 7 people around a heavy oak table. The room smelled of roasted garlic, red wine, and the faint ozone scent of incoming rain. We ate the meal. I listened to Sylvia detail her plans for rearranging the living room furniture to better suit her daily routine. I listened to Mia ask Julian if she could park her car in my driveway permanently once Sylvia moved in. Julian nodded generously, offering up my property piece by piece. When the plates were cleared, Julian tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. He stood up, placing a loving hand on Sylvia's shoulder. He looked around the table, his chest puffed with unearned pride. He announced that the family was finally coming together. He declared that Sylvia would be moving into the house next weekend, that they were converting the spare room into her permanent suite, and that he was proud to provide a home for his mother after all she had suffered. Sylvia dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin. Mia clapped. I wiped my mouth with my napkin, set it neatly beside my plate, and stood up. The room fell quiet, waiting for my speech of welcome. I reached under my chair and lifted a thick, heavy manila folder onto the polished oak table. I opened it. Julian, I said, my voice dropping into the precise, emotionless cadence I used during hostile corporate audits. Before we discuss room assignments, we need to clarify the ownership of this property. Julian chuckled, a nervous, patronizing sound. Clara? Honey, we don't need to get technical tonight. We absolutely do. I replied, pulling the first document from the folder. This is the deed to this house, recorded with the King County Clerk. The sole owner listed is Clara Michelle Vance, not Clara Rossi. Just me. I slid the deed down the center of the table. And this, I continued, pulling out the second page, is the notarized gift letter from my parents, establishing this home as my separate property, purchased entirely with their funds prior to our marriage. Sylvia's tearful smile froze. She looked at Julian, confusion clouding her features. Julian's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He slammed his hand onto the table, rattling the silverware. Clara, what the hell are you doing? You're embarrassing my mother? I haven't even started, I said, pulling out the heavy, spiral-bound report prepared by Marcus. I dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud. Over the last 8 months, Julian established a fraudulent company named Summit Property Ventures, LLC. He systematically drafted funds from our joint household account, invoicing for structural repairs and flooring upgrades that never occurred on a house he does not own. I looked directly at Sylvia, whose face was rapidly draining of all color. He embezzled $28,400 of marital funds, and he deposited every single cent into a high-yield savings account at Pacific Cascade Credit Union, an account registered exclusively in your name. Sylvia, the silence in the dining room became absolute, a suffocating vacuum. The only sound was the rain lashing against the dining room window. Mia's mouth fell open. She looked at her brother, her eyes wide. Julian, what is she talking about? Did you steal money? Julian didn't answer her. He was staring at the forensic accounting report as if it were a venomous snake. His jaw worked silently. He looked at my father, then at his mother, the charming facade shattering into jagged pieces of panic. Clara, he choked out, his voice thin and reedy. You went through my desk. You spied on me. I audited my own finances. I corrected, my tone dropping to a whisper that carried across the silent room. I tracked the money you stole from me to fund your mother's retirement. You tried to give away keys to my house. You tried to force a permanent resident into my sanctuary. And you funded it with my paycheck. Sylvia stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. Her hands were shaking violently. You are again, ungrateful girl, she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You have no idea what it means to struggle. My son was just trying to protect his family. He isn't protecting his family. Sylvia, I replied, refusing to break eye contact. He is committing financial fraud. My lawyer filed the petition for divorce yesterday morning. She also filed a motion to establish this house as separate property, which is incontestable. The forensic accounting report has been submitted to the court. You will be legally compelled to return every stolen dollar, or my attorney will place a constructive trust on your accounts. Julian lost his mind. The terrifying realization that he had absolutely no leverage, no money, and no claim to the house broke him. He grabbed his wine glass and hurled it violently across the room. It smashed against the brick fireplace, sending shards of crystal and dark red wine exploding across the hearth. Martha gasped, shrinking back into her chair. Thomas stood up slowly. My father didn't shout. He didn't raise his fists. He simply looked at Julian with the heavy, dangerous calm of a man who spent his life working with heavy machinery. You need to leave my daughter's house, Thomas said softly. Right now, Julian looked around the room. He looked at his mother, who was sobbing into her hands. He looked at his sister, who was staring at the floor in mortification. He looked at me, standing tall at the head of the table, entirely untouched by his rage. He had nothing left to say. He turned, grabbed his coat from the hallway tree, and walked out the front door into the freezing rain. Sylvia and Mia followed in a hurried, humiliated silence, leaving the box of vintage wine glasses abandoned on the floor. When the door clicked shut, the silence returned, but the tension was gone. The air felt instantly lighter. My father walked over to the fireplace, grabbed the small brass dustpan, and silently began sweeping up the shattered crystal and wiping the wine from the bricks. I watched him kneel on the floor of the house he had bought me, cleaning up the mess of the people who tried to take it from us. I finally let out a long, shuddering breath, the adrenaline leaving my blood in a rushing wave. The legal proceedings were remarkably brief. Julian's attorney took one look at the forensic report and the property deed and advised him to surrender. There was no trial. Julian was forced to reimburse the joint account entirely from his share of his personal retirement fund. Sylvia had to wire the remaining balance directly to my counsel. The divorce was finalized in 8 months. Julian moved into Sylvia's cramped apartment in Bellevue, trapped in the exact life he had stolen to avoid. The first weekend after the final decree was signed, I walked through my quiet, secure house. I opened the windows to let the crisp Seattle breeze wash through the rooms. I went to my home office, sat in my ergonomic chair, and looked at the thick deadbolt on the door, realizing I would never need to lock it again inside my own home. I uninstalled the smart lock from the front door, replacing it with a heavy, traditional brass deadbolt. One key, my key. That afternoon, I drove to a local nursery and bought 3 flats of English lavender. I knelt in the front yard, my hands deep in the dark. Damp soil, planting them along the walkway. The smell of the crushed purple blossoms rose into the cold air. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my jeans, and looked at my house. It wasn't just a structure of wood and glass. It was a fortress of boundaries, secured by the truth and guarded by the unyielding understanding that no one is entitled to the life you have built. I walked up the steps, locked the heavy brass door behind me, and finally rested in the quiet